Huge cracks continue to show in Canada's financial and economic foundation, but if these are dealt with correctly now, could be huge for Canada's future and how we could rebuild. If they are dealt with poorly, we could not only be kicking the can down the road, we could be making problems so much worse. And as the US-Canada trade relations continue to deteriorate, so much so that people are scared to even deal with America at all now, it's getting crazy. We're going to have to talk about that. Canada needs more diversified industry, and we are seeing the winds shift. Mainstream news sources are changing their tune entirely. It's been wild. There's a ton to get into today with all of the paradigm shifts, but we also have to show, of course, some horrible choices made by the federal government, which is why we can't trust their spending yet again. Let's get into it. Starting off, we do have to talk about the real estate market, and that is because we have seen a major misallocation of funds in Canada for over a decade now, and it is coming to a head when we see things like Toronto new home sales fall to record low. Just 42 condos sold in the city. That is actually a big deal. I know that it just sounds like, well, what does that mean? So much of Canada's economy has been tied to real estate growth. In fact, a lot of the consumer spending is based exclusively around real estate growth. People have used HELOCs and lines of credit against their house to be able to upgrade their lifestyle. So as this continues to shrink, that is a big deal. Getting into the article here, Greater Toronto real estate developers found no relief from the market rut in May. Data shows new home sales hit a record low in May, marking an 8th month in historically weak demand. Even though just a handful of new homes sold in a city of millions, sellers have been resistant to cutting prices further. The million-dollar question is, how long can prices remain sticky now that there are more than 17 months of inventory on hand? Now, that is the million-dollar question because we are in a really interesting game of chicken right now, and we are seeing inventory continues to build. Something has got to give. Sellers have got to accept that they have to take lower prices for their houses if they want to get them sold. And buyers seem to be in a position where they're okay with waiting. Right now, it clearly seems like a buyer's market. If I was out there looking, I would be putting out major lowball offers right now. One of the bigger things that we need to pay attention to, because with real estate, month over month isn't exactly a super important statistic to look into. What you need to look into is because it's a long-term thing. It's why anytime I talk about investing in real estate and these things, it's a 5, 7, 10-year plan. And when we see the Greater Toronto new home sales hit a record low in May, so this is new home sales, not just retrading of existing inventory. This is a big deal because new home starts take a long time. But as we've talked about on this channel, a lot of the growth and a lot of the demand has been through the mass immigration problem, which I've always said, which lever is easier to shut off? Is it easier to turn off the immigration lever or pump on the building lever? It's way harder to do that. And we are going to continue to see numbers. This is the number that I thought was wild. And I don't know how this isn't a headline across more places, but the Greater Toronto developers saw just 137 condo sales in May, down 74% from last year and 93% below the 10-year average. That's almost 100%. That's a big deal. And if this continues, because they go on to say in the article, you know, all these developers in Toronto was saying we need 20,000 units, we need 30,000 units, and the number just kept getting bigger as immigration got bigger. But now that the numbers are shut off, they're going, well, those numbers are kind of seeming like a bit of a joke now, as no inventory is moving. And this is why it's important you don't get sucked into this again, because what's going to happen is we're going to see sneaky things like this start to build up again. Canada's population standstill rattling Vancouver's housing industry. And what are they calling for? Now they're calling for removal of foreign buyer bans and these other things so that they can get inventory moving again. And I will say, having sales is important because if all of this falls off a cliff, that means no new starts will happen, and then 5 years from now, we will run into a problem where no inventory will be available in 5 years. So prices are going to have to adjust to find that balance where people can afford again. But it's really funny because every article now is just so confidently saying, for the first time in 74 years, the populations of both BC and Ontario dropped by a few thousand people in the first months of 2025. So we knew all of this was driven by population growth, just now they're talking about it. Toronto and Vancouver are the two most expensive housing markets in Canada. They're obviously going to get hit the most when it comes to slashing immigration. But those are also where you drop the rock in the pond and all of the prices ripple out from there. So if those prices continue to go down, they will go down in other markets as well, which could lead to better affordability, but it's also going to be devastating to the Canadian economy. Absolutely devastating if real estate continues to slow and prices continue to go down. That's not a bad thing in the long term, potentially, which we will get into in a second. But one thing I want to call out early on is we are seeing stories like this. Toronto developers stay afloat borrowing against unsold condos. That might be a bit of a problem. If it's unsold inventory, they're borrowing at older prices saying, oh yeah, this is worth $700,000. Let's borrow at that loan to value. But meanwhile, it's not selling at $700,000. And again, I don't know the exact appraisals that are coming in, but you're hearing about these blanket appraisals that are covering buildings from a couple of years ago with old prices. And if they're borrowing on that to keep themselves afloat and these don't continue to sell, this is basically how the 2008 major real estate crash happened. And the financial crash happened in America because they just kept repackaging different levels of debt and it just got out of hand. And then there was so much borrowing and so much money creation. And then everybody was just repackaging loans and selling it to each other. It just turned into a nonsense thing. And if these guys are going to repackage their own debt that they're already borrowing on just to keep themselves afloat, that is not a good thing. Now, this could be a good thing if the real estate market is to get hit. It's going to be devastating up front. And we talked about it on this channel that there's been years where it's been estimated that real estate has had an impact of up to 40% of Canada's GDP. That's insane. That's not good. And that was only done through mass immigration and an increase of demand. But what also did it was Canadian banks were only willing to invest in real estate. Canadian banks have some of the lowest investment levels when it comes to investing in small business and in corporate financing. So yes, this is going to hurt. Everybody who's cheering on prices coming down in real estate, be prepared. It would be very, very bad for everyone in the short term if we choose to rebuild the right way after that and we fix the immigration problem, we fix all of these things. And it's not like we need zero immigration because at the end of the day, Canadians are not having enough kids. But if we can retarget back to 250,000, more reasonable numbers, very specific targeted plans, Canada actually could rebuild much stronger. And like I said, the banks have not been wanting to invest in Canadians' businesses, and America is crushing Canada. Look at this chart. This is the kind of chart that I want people to pay attention to because whenever I say Canada doesn't produce anything, we've got a fake economy, it's because of charts like this. All of our economy has been public spending, immigration, and real estate. Because when it comes to private business, this is the amount of investment growth we've seen. And since 2010, this is from Kirk Lubimov, since 2010, Canada has had barely any growth in real business investment and pretty much zero growth since 2014. This is us versus the US. Can anybody notice any difference? Their growth has continued to skyrocket since 2010. But this is also due to a fundamental difference in our banking system. Canadian banks are essentially rewarded for not investing in Canadian businesses. So when they don't loan to Canadian businesses, that means you end up with charts like this because it's so hard in Canada to get business financing. And that's why I yell about Wealthsimple on this channel so much, because it's a different type of startup banking when they're starting to loan to different businesses and other things. That's creating more competition against the big 5 or 6 banks, which are an oligopoly, which control everything in Canada, which only want to invest in real estate. When we don't diversify, we don't make things better, we're going to end up with other articles like this. Did you like the video yet? It helps get these videos in front of more people. We're trying to grow the channel. Don't forget to sign up for Wealthsimple. Link is down below. You get $25. I get $25. We're taking on the big banks. It's helping revamp Canada. Let's get back to it. Canada exports to US shrink to smallest share since 1997. Yes, of course the tariffs absolutely have something to do with the amount of exports that are going to America right now. It would be disingenuous to say otherwise. That being said, if Canada wanted to invest in our businesses, make ourselves a desirable trading partner, make ourselves somebody that the US wanted to work with, these numbers wouldn't have to be shrinking down. Scott Bessent was just out there on Fox again today talking about how difficult Canada was to deal with, especially when this remains an issue and dairy supply management could sour Canada-US trade talks. It's going to be a problem. We know supply management is a problem inside of Canada. Canadian provinces and just Canadians suffer from supply management. But the article says here, Canada canceled a digital service tax on U.S. technology companies this week in order to preserve trade talks with the U.S. President Donald Trump, but another irritant in agriculture could be a bigger thorn in the ongoing negotiations. Analysts said ditching the digital service tax was politically easy for Carney compared to even discussing Canada's supply management system that since the 1970s has tightly controlled supplies of dairy, eggs, and poultry by restricting production and limiting imports through onerous tariffs. And this is one of the main things Donald Trump has talked about for years. Even before he was president, he had a problem with this. This isn't new. Like we've talked about in other videos, politically, it is a hard thing to take on, and I blame Quebec. We don't need to just blame Quebec for these problems because Canadians feel unwelcome in the U.S. as mistrust remains high. New poll. Well, let's see who these Canadians are who seem to mistrust the U.S. Now that Canada's trade war with America has surged back into public consciousness like a blast from the recent past, a new poll suggests Canadian frustration with mistrust of the U.S. remains high despite a slight easing. In March, for example, polling showed a dramatic realignment of Canadian attitudes toward its southern neighbor. Europe and Britain were suddenly the countries that Canada felt best about. Canadians were starting to feel about America the same way they felt about Russia. If you feel the same, you might need to stop slurping up the mainstream news, but we'll see how we ended up here. But lately, with U.S. President Donald Trump's attention mostly elsewhere, where the signs of a slight bump back, despite troubling news developments like the death of a Canadian citizen in the U.S. immigration custody, you guys know that he was like a drug dealer who was there illegally for 40 years. This is the funny part, okay? More than half of Canadians now say they no longer feel welcome in the United States, for example. And this sentiment is the strongest among women and older people. Wow, breaking news. Women's feelings are hurt, and now they're taking it out on somebody else. It's so funny because there is no reason to not trust America and feel unsafe or unwelcome going down there at all as just a general Canadian tourist who's going down to the U.S. However, they're trying to hurt us. They're doing these trade negotiations. Like, it's just the fact that these women are getting pulled and being like, I don't trust them. I just don't trust them. And then, of course, the old people who are just slurping up all of the mainstream media. And before the boomers weigh in, it's obviously going to be the liberal old people in Canada. Most conservatives so far in Canada still trust the U.S. and understand they are just acting on behalf of their own best interest. The problem is women often and liberals just are run by their emotions and they're easily tricked. And what happens when they're easily tricked? We end up with stories like this. 300 million federal climate programs fail to produce new jobs or lower emissions, a report says. A report by the Department of Natural Resources says 2018 federal climate programs that promised new jobs and lower emissions failed to provide either, according to Blacklock's reporter. It's so funny because we're supposed to trust all of these federal programs and all of these things. Don't you understand? Because what is one of the number one things that they say with Canada changing its economy and getting on board with the climate agenda and all of these things? It's supposed to say, oh, it's going to diversify the industry. It's going to create jobs. But in fact, managers stopped collecting data that would establish whether taxpayers received value for money for the programs that received multi-year funding to the tune of $301 million to subsidize power projects. So not only did they stop collecting data on their actual impact on emissions, they didn't create any jobs at all. So we, as the Canadian taxpayer, have set $301.38 million on fire. And the only reason that we've been paying this money has been emotional reaction through mainstream manipulation. But we are seeing mainstream news sources are willing to call a spade a spade. And when they bring on the experts from the auto industry, who, again, politically were too scared to talk about this stuff before, but now that it's getting safe, everybody is, they're letting us know EVs are dumb.
Well, Canadian automakers have asked Prime Minister Mark Carney to repeal zero-emission vehicle mandates, warning that electric vehicle sales in Canada are decreasing. The association also says it would be impossible to reach the zero-emission vehicle mandate that starts taking effect in 2026. Let's hear more on this from Brian Kingston. Brian Kingston is president of the Canadian Vehicles Manufacturers Association. Brian, thanks a lot for joining us.
Ignore the tech issues, guys. I don't know what's going on. The audio's been delayed with the video.
So what exactly has the association urged the government and the Prime Minister to do?
Well, the automotive industry in Canada is under great pressure right now, some of which we can control and some of which we cannot. Of course, the ongoing trade discussions with the US and tariffs on automotive exports are a huge challenge, but we don't control the outcome of that discussion. What we can control is making sure that the Canadian economy is more competitive and that we have policies in place that set automakers up for success. And the EV mandate is impossible to achieve. 20% EV sales in 2026. We just hit sales of 8.7% last month.
Impossible to achieve is what he's saying. And we all knew this. And we all know this. But for some reason, the liberal politicians yelling in the House are allowed to just make stuff up as they go along. And there's no accountability. I don't know how they're just allowed to lie all the time with zero accountability.
There is simply no way to close that gap. And if this regulation stays in place, automakers will have no choice but to start restricting internal combustion engine vehicle sales in Canada by the hundreds of thousands. This will be devastating to the industry and dealerships across Canada.
Remind us of who your association represents, who is included in the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, and how many of them manufacture electric vehicles.
Yes, so we represent Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, the longest established automakers here in Canada, and all of which have manufacturing presence and have made investments into the EV supply chain. These companies are committed to electrification. There are record numbers of EVs in the market. There's over 100 models now available in every size and segment. The challenge is the consumer demand is simply not there. And
yeah, that's quite a challenge. And we're going to get into it in a second, but most of the consumer demand has always been incentive driven, government incentive driven, taxpayer incentive driven. And that's what people don't understand. Like, most of the growth has been because taxpayer dollars have been spent on it. This is all being done through no organic demand at all.
And it has in fact been collapsing. Just to give you a sense of how big this gap is, an additional 180,000 EVs would need to be sold next year to hit that 20% target. There is no way that that is going to happen.
Why do you think demand for EVs is collapsing?
A few factors at play. First of all, you of course have the tariff situation, which is raising costs throughout the supply chain. But more importantly, there's just a number of barriers to adoption that haven't been adequately addressed. And we're moving now from the early adopters. These were people, typically high-income households, buying a second or third car, keen on the technology. Now we're trying to
Yeah, so basically, you know, like rich liberals in cities who are like, yeah, I can have an extra toy and buy a little bit. And then the problem is these toys were used as baseline numbers for growth. So they're like, oh, well, we sold 50 toys in that year, and the next year we sold 100 toys. And now, as a result, that means sales are up 100%. If we continue to go 100% up, we can be completely EV in 5 years.
Transition into mass market adoption. So think about your family with one vehicle that does a lot of driving. That's a very different conversation. And that type of consumer has questions about charging infrastructure, vehicle range, and of course, price. And right now, we don't have the infrastructure in place to hit mass adoption. So we've got to get those preconditions right. Let's work on building out the ecosystem. The consumer will come along, but if you mandate an arbitrary ratio, you're setting the industry and frankly, Canadians up for failure.
It's not possible, and for a multitude of reasons. Like I've said in other videos, if just the Canadian market was 100% EV, it would require all of the global battery recycling capacity just to manage Canada, not including anywhere else. It's completely ideologically driven. It has no economical foundation at all. And that's why, even though we see charts like this, that Canada is the preferred oil supplier among the G7 nations, and that includes other things like LNG. Look, when people are polled, People want to work with Canada. They know that we produce the best, most ethical oil as of now. And for some reason, our government's like, no, let's electrify everything. Let's go the opposite direction of where all the demand is. Speaking of ideological and no economic basis, I wanted to show this video quickly before I have another story I want to cover about the government, why we can't trust their spending, and this one needs to get more attention. It absolutely has to be talked about. Let's talk about this quickly.
Dozens of new Canadians took their citizenship oath yesterday at a special ceremony in Assiniboine Park, marking a new milestone in their lives.
And that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada.
30 new Canadians from 12 different countries gathered at the performance.
Okay, here we are. We're just getting into little ideology problems here, okay? Because I have nothing against this woman personally. However, let's remove all of the arguments that people are going to call you names for, okay? We're just going to talk about economics. This woman is clearly 60 or over 60, okay? She's not going to be working any productive job in Canada. She just became a citizen now. I don't know her history, but chances are she's not a lifetime taxpayer, and she's getting into her retirement years as she's becoming a citizen, which means she's not going to be working a productive job, but she is going to be costing hundreds of thousands of dollars through healthcare, social systems, all of these costs. And now she's getting brought in, getting her citizenship this late in her life. It doesn't make economic sense for Canada, who needs workers. We have a labor shortage to be giving citizenship or any level of permits to these type of people. If somebody is 55, 60 plus, there's no economic benefit from them coming to Canada unless they are extremely targeted positions. If this woman's a doctor who's going to work for the next 10 years, then I'm wrong. I just don't think that's the case for some reason. Economically, there is no reason for her to come to Canada. They always talk about labor shortage. Who's going to take care of, who's going to drive your Uber if you get rid of immigrants? First of all, we can deal with less Ubers. We dealt with it before. So I'm going to stand by the fact that if you're 55, 60 plus, there's no reason for you to come to Canada at all. Eventually, I'm going to talk about family reunification and that part of the immigration bubble, because we were bringing over people, grandparents. So under this umbrella of labor shortage and needing to replace and all of these people, because Canadians are not having kids, which they aren't, we are bringing over grandparents to solve that. So as our population ages, let's bring over, foreign grandparents. That's going to help a lot. But we know the government makes horrible decisions, and that's how we end up with this story here. And this story really ticked me off. Let's get into it.
I didn't feel like I was there to work. I felt like I was there to kind of hang out and socialize.
This former employee, whose identity we have agreed to protect for fear of repercussions, says working at the Vaccine Injury Support Program felt like high school.
There was definitely no shortage of phones out, watching YouTube. The slushy machine was cool. Ping pong was definitely a regular thing.
So a bit of context, this is the company who is supposed to be in charge of Canada's Vaccine Injury Support Program. He's talking about them having slushy machines, people sitting around watching YouTube, playing ping pong, getting tens of millions of federal government dollars to take care of Canadians, okay? And this is what's happening.
The federal government hired a company called Oxaro to run the program and paid them $50.6 million. Global News spoke with more than a dozen current and former Oxaro employees, whose comments included working there was a joke, with drinking Fridays, inexperienced underpaid staff who weren't properly trained.
I don't think anyone actually understood the severity or the relevance of the program that was being contracted to the firm.
The Vaccine Injury Support Program, or VISP, was created to provide financial support to people who are seriously and permanently injured by vaccines. People like Ross Whiteman.
They're just doing a piss poor job of supporting the vulnerable.
A former commercial pilot and realtor, Ross was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome after receiving his COVID vaccine.
Okay, so here we have a Canadian-born man who was damaged by the mandated vaccines. Don't let them rewrite history. We saw how much pressure they put the average Canadian under to get the vaccine, and he was a pilot. I'm assuming there would have been a ton of pressure on him to get it.
A rare but recognized side effect. His claim was among the first to be approved by VISP. And yet 4 years later, every day is a fight against his body and the program.
At the moment, I'm probably out about $25,000.
In its policy for VISP, the Public Health Agency of Canada said the injured will have fair and timely support. But Ross Whiteman waited nearly a year and a half while unable to work for a full injury payout, 3 more months for income replacement, and still regularly battles the program for his medical expenses.
It could take a month, it could take 12 months.
Some former workers say there was no sense of urgency.
There was an amount of work you were expected
That's crazy.
to finish,
Every day.
and you weren't hitting those targets.
No, probably well below.
Why would that guy be bragging about that? That's crazy. We can see the ideological problems that are happening in Canada, which will lead to economic destruction of Canada, whether it's focusing on the wrong industries or bringing in economically unproductive to the point where they are drags on the economy and the taxpayer. When we have Canadians who are here, who can't get taken care of. They were medically damaged from the vaccine mandates, and they're struggling to get access to funds. We see what happens when the government keeps contracting out these private companies. They have no idea what they're doing. They have no oversight, and they are happy to set the money on fire. And it's all just to keep the women happy because they're scared to go to the US. I think we got to straighten a few things up now. I think we're clearly seeing we need to retarget some of our goals and where the ideology is headed. But if you made it this far in the video, you absolutely rock. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps get these videos in front of more people trying to grow the channel. Don't forget to sign up for Wealthsimple. Link is down below. You get $25, I get $25, and have a great rest of your day.